Tell them how you kissed me first." That was the exact moment I realized my life was officially over, because there were at least 30 people in that room, all staring, all waiting, and Adrian Cole, of course it had to be him, was standing way too close behind me, his voice low enough that only I could hear it, and somehow still loud enough that it felt like everyone else could too, like the words had weight, like they were pressing into my spine and locking me in place. And the worst part was I couldn't even say he was wrong. Because I did kiss him, I absolutely did, which would be easier to accept if I had meant to kiss him, or even known it was him. But no, of course not. Because if there's one thing I'm exceptionally talented at, it's making the worst possible decision in the most public, irreversible way imaginable. And it all started 3 nights ago at a party I almost didn't even go to, which, in hindsight, I really should have trusted my instincts on, because nothing good has ever come from me standing in a crowded apartment holding a red plastic cup pretending I know how to socialize like a normal human being. Especially not when there's music blasting, lights dimmed just enough to make everyone look hotter than they actually are, and me trying way too hard to casually run into my crush without looking like I planned my entire evening around it. Which, okay, I did, but that's not the point. The point is I was doing fine, or at least fine by my standards, which mostly means I hadn't embarrassed myself yet. I was hovering near the kitchen island, sipping something that tasted like it could remove paint, telling myself I would leave in 10 minutes, 15 max, when I saw him across the room. Or at least I thought I did. Same height, same dark jacket, same general shape of someone I had spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about. And in that moment, with the music pulsing and my brain slightly fogged and my confidence boosted just enough to be dangerous, I made a decision that would ruin my entire life. I crossed the room, heart pounding like I was about to do something brave instead of incredibly stupid, and before I could overthink it, before I could stop myself, I reached out, grabbed the front of his shirt, and kissed him, and for a split second everything felt right, like I had finally done something bold, something cinematic, like this was the kind of story people tell later with a laugh and a shrug. Except then he moved, just slightly, just enough for the angle to shift, for the light to catch his face, and suddenly nothing was right anymore, because it wasn't him. It was Adrian Cole, and if you don't know who Adrian Cole is, imagine the worst possible person you could accidentally kiss in front of half your social circle, and then multiply that by 10. Because Adrian isn't just some random guy, he's the guy, the one people notice when he walks into a room, the one who doesn't forget anything, the one currently looking at me like he had just discovered something deeply interesting. And I remember pulling back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, my brain short-circuiting, my mouth opening and closing like maybe words would come out if I tried hard enough. Except they didn't. Obviously they didn't, because what exactly are you supposed to say after you accidentally kiss the wrong person at a party, especially when that person tilts his head slightly, studies you like a puzzle he's already halfway solved, and says, calm and quiet and entirely too amused? Well, that was unexpected, and in that exact moment, standing there under cheap string lights with music thumping in my ears and my dignity lying somewhere on the floor behind me, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, I had just made a mistake I couldn't take back, and second, Adrian Cole was not going to let me forget it. I should have left. That was the first thought that slammed into my brain the second I realized it was Adrian. Because there is a very specific kind of instinct that kicks in when you accidentally make direct contact with someone way out of your emotional pay grade. And that instinct is run, just run. Do not explain, do not apologize, do not make it worse. And unfortunately I ignored that instinct for approximately 3 seconds too long, which was just enough time for him to look at me like that, like he had already decided this was going to be entertaining, and then my body finally caught up with my brain and I turned and walked away, which quickly turned into speed walking, which then turned into me grabbing my jacket from a random chair and practically shoving my way toward the door like the apartment was on fire and I was the only one who knew. Except no one stopped me. No one even seemed to notice, which somehow made it worse, because it meant the only person who really registered what just happened was him. And that felt infinitely more dangerous. I made it outside into the cool night air and just stood there on the sidewalk for a second, breathing like I had run a mile even though it was barely half a block, my heart still racing, my thoughts tripping over each other in the worst possible loop. You kissed him. You actually kissed him. What is wrong with you? And more importantly, why did he not look surprised? Like, yes, he said it was unexpected, but there was something else there. Something calm and steady and way too aware, and I did not like that. I did not like that at all. I told myself it did not matter, that it was a one-time thing, a stupid mistake that would dissolve into nothing by morning. Because parties are like that, right? Things happen, people forget, everyone moves on. That is what I told myself as I walked the 6 blocks back to my apartment, hands shoved into my pockets, replaying the moment over and over again like my brain was determined to make sure I never experienced peace again. And by the time I got home, I had fully committed to a plan, which was simple and flawless and definitely not built on denial. I was going to pretend it never happened. I was going to avoid him at all costs. And if I did somehow run into him again, which was unlikely, I would act like a normal person who had not completely misread a situation and kissed the wrong guy in front of witnesses. I even said it out loud while brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection like I was giving myself a motivational speech. This is fine. You are fine. Everything is fine. And for a few hours, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I almost believed it until my phone buzzed on the nightstand and I ignored it, because there was no universe where I was emotionally prepared to deal with any kind of communication at that moment, especially not one that might somehow be connected to the worst decision of my life. And eventually I fell asleep, or at least drifted into something close enough to it, only to wake up the next morning with that same heavy feeling in my chest, like my brain had spent the entire night reminding itself of what happened just in case I forgot. And as I dragged myself out of bed, grabbed my phone, and finally checked my notifications, I realized something very important, something that made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with last night and everything to do with what came next, because apparently, avoiding Adrian Cole was not going to be nearly as easy as I thought. The message was from my manager, which was already a bad sign, but the subject line was what really made my stomach drop, because it said mandatory team meeting 9 a.m. sharp. And there is something about the phrase mandatory that never leads to anything good, especially when you are running on 4 hours of sleep and a full emotional replay of your worst decision. I stared at the screen for a solid 10 seconds, hoping I had misread it, hoping this was one of those optional but strongly encouraged things that people ignore all the time. Except no, there it was again, 9 a.m., attendance required, which meant I had exactly 45 minutes to get ready, commute downtown, and mentally prepare to act like a functioning adult who had not kissed the wrong person in front of half the city 3 nights ago. And for a brief, irrational moment, I wondered if this was somehow connected, which made no sense, because my workplace and that party existed in completely separate worlds. And there was absolutely no reason for them to overlap. None. Zero. Impossible. I repeated that to myself as I rushed through getting dressed, nearly tripping over my own shoes, burning my tongue on coffee that was definitely too hot, and speed walking the 6 blocks to the subway like I could outrun my own thoughts. The train ride felt longer than usual, every stop dragging out just enough for my brain to spiral again. You are overthinking. It was just a kiss. People kiss all the time, except they usually know who they are kissing, which felt like a pretty important detail I somehow missed. By the time I reached the office building, a tall glass structure that always made me feel slightly underqualified just by standing near it, I had managed to convince myself that today would be normal. Just a meeting, maybe a new project. Nothing dramatic, nothing connected to him. I swiped my badge, stepped inside, and immediately noticed something was off. People were moving faster, talking in low voices, the kind of quiet buzz that means something important is happening. And I hated it. I hated it instantly, because I do not do well with unexpected situations, especially not ones that feel like they are building towards something I am not prepared for. I made my way to the conference room, slipping into a seat near the end of the table, trying to blend in, trying to look like I belonged there, which is always a challenge when you are an intern surrounded by people who actually know what they are doing. And for a few minutes, everything was fine, just small talk, laptops opening, coffee cups being set down, normal, manageable, until the door opened, and I did not even look up at first, because why would I? People come in late to meetings all the time, except the room shifted, just slightly, the air tightening in that subtle way that makes you aware of someone before you actually see them. And then I heard it, a voice, calm, familiar, and entirely too close to the one I had been trying not to think about for the past 12 hours, and my entire body went still before my brain even caught up. No, no, absolutely not. That is not possible, I told myself, which is exactly when I made the mistake of looking up, and there he was, Adrian Cole, standing at the front of the room like he had always belonged there, like this was completely normal, like he had not been the last person I expected to see in my professional life, dressed in a dark suit that somehow made him look even more composed, more controlled, more untouchable than he had at the party, and for a second, just a second, our eyes met, and I swear there was a flicker of recognition there, something sharp and knowing, before his expression settled back into something neutral, something professional, like nothing had happened at all, which should have been a relief. It should have made everything easier, except it did not, because then he spoke, addressing the room, introducing himself as the new director overseeing our department, and I felt the ground shift under me in a way that had nothing to do with physics, and everything to do with the very real, very immediate realization that avoiding Adrian Cole was no longer an option. And as he continued speaking, outlining goals and expectations and things I absolutely was not processing, there was only one thought looping in my head, clear and unstoppable. I accidentally kissed my new boss, and he definitely remembers. I did not hear a single word after that. Not really. Because once your brain locks onto a sentence like I accidentally kissed my new boss, it tends to loop it on repeat like a broken alarm you cannot turn off, and everything else becomes background noise. Adrian was still talking, something about restructuring teams, upcoming deadlines, expectations, all of it delivered in that calm, measured tone that made it sound like he had everything under control, which only made my situation feel even more out of control. Because how was he standing there acting completely normal when 3 nights ago I had literally grabbed his shirt and kissed him in a room full of people? How was that not even slightly affecting him? Or maybe it was. Maybe that brief look earlier was not nothing. Maybe he was just better at hiding it. Which, honestly, made it worse, because I am not good at hiding anything. My entire face tends to broadcast my internal state like a live feed, and right now that internal state was pure panic. I kept my eyes locked on my laptop screen, even though it was not open to anything useful, just a blank document that I was pretending to take notes on, typing random words so it looked like I was engaged, which was probably the least convincing performance of productivity in the history of office culture. Every now and then I felt it, that awareness, like someone was looking in my direction, and I refused to look up, because if I made eye contact again, I was not sure I would survive it. The meeting eventually ended, or at least people started standing up and closing their laptops, which I took as my cue to leave immediately. No lingering, no small talk, just grab my things and go. Except the universe clearly had other plans, because as I stood up, my manager appeared at my side like she had been waiting for this exact moment, smiling in that bright, efficient way that always means more work is coming. Ethan, she said. Perfect timing. I want to introduce you to Adrian. You will be assisting with his new project. And for a second, I genuinely thought I misheard her, like maybe my brain had filled in the wrong name. Except she turned, gestured, and there he was again, closer this time. Close enough that I could see the exact shade of his eyes. The way his expression shifted just slightly as he looked at me, recognition flickering there again. Sharper now, more deliberate, and I could not escape, not without making it obvious, not without confirming every single fear currently spiraling in my head. So I did the only thing I could do. I stayed, rooted in place like my feet had decided betrayal was the right move today. This is Ethan Brooks, my manager continued. One of our interns, very capable, and I almost laughed at that, because capable was not the word I would use to describe someone who accidentally kisses their boss before even knowing he is their boss. But I nodded anyway, forcing a smile. That felt about as natural as everything else in this situation. Nice to meet you, I said. Which was technically true, in a very complicated, extremely unfortunate way. Adrian's gaze held mine for just a fraction longer than necessary. Not inappropriate, not obvious, just enough to make my pulse spike again. And then he did something worse than calling me out, worse than mentioning it. He smiled, small, controlled, like he was in on something I was not, and said, "We have met before, have we not?" And that was it. That was the moment my carefully constructed plan to pretend nothing happened completely collapsed, because there it was, out in the open, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and I could feel my brain scrambling for a response, something normal, something professional, something that would not confirm that yes. I was the idiot who kissed him at a party and then tried to pretend it never happened. Except nothing came out right away, just a brief, humiliating silence where I stood there, caught between telling the truth and running for the nearest exit. And the worst part was the way he watched me, patient, calm, like he had all the time in the world to see what I would do next. I knew I had about 2 seconds to respond before that silence turned into something noticeable, something that would make my manager glance between us and start asking questions I absolutely did not have answers for. So I did what any rational, completely unprepared person would do. I panicked internally and defaulted to the safest possible lie that was not technically a lie. I think we were at the same event, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could, which was impressive considering my heart felt like it was trying to break out of my chest. Adrian's expression did not change much, but there was something there, something almost amused, like he knew exactly what I was doing and was choosing to let me have it for now. Yes, he said, his tone smooth and neutral. I believe we were, and that should have been the end of it. It should have stayed vague, professional, forgettable, except he added, after a brief pause that felt entirely intentional, you made quite an impression, and that was it. That was the exact moment I stopped breathing for a second, because there it was again, not direct, not explicit, but close enough that I could feel the meaning sitting just under the surface, waiting, and I had to fight every instinct that told me to react, to over-explain, to apologize for something that had not technically been addressed out loud. So instead I nodded, because apparently nodding was the only motor function I still had access to, and said, right, well, good to see you again, which sounded completely normal if you ignored the fact that I was internally screaming. My manager seemed satisfied with that, already moving on to discuss project details, timelines, responsibilities, things I should have been paying attention to but was absolutely not processing, because now I was hyper-aware of Adrian standing just a few feet away, of the way his presence seemed to take up more space than it should, of the way he listened when my manager spoke and then occasionally glanced in my direction like he was checking something, confirming something, and I did not know what that something was. The conversation eventually wrapped up with a list of tasks that I was supposed to start on immediately. And then, just like that, it was over. My manager excused herself to take a call, leaving me alone in a small pocket of space that suddenly felt much too quiet, much too still, and I absolutely knew, that if I stayed there for even one more second, something was going to happen, something I was not prepared for. So I turned, ready to leave, ready to retreat to the relative safety of my desk where I could pretend this entire interaction had been manageable. Except I did not get more than 2 steps before his voice stopped me. Ethan, he said, and it was the first time he had used my name, which should not have mattered as much as it did, except it did, because it grounded everything in a way I was not ready for. I paused, slowly, like if I moved too fast this would become even more real, and turned back. Yeah, I managed, which was not my best work, but at least it was a word. Adrian stepped a little closer, not invading my space, not doing anything inappropriate, just enough that I could feel the shift in distance, the awareness of him becoming sharper, more focused, and then he said, quiet enough that no one else could hear, you tend to act on impulse at social events. Or was that a one-time occurrence? And I swear my brain just stopped, completely, because there it was, finally, not hidden, not vague, just close enough to the truth to make my pulse spike all over again. And I had no idea what the correct answer to that question was, whether I should deny it, deflect it, or just accept that there was no version of this conversation where I came out looking composed. So I did the only thing I could do. I let out a small, slightly breathless laugh, and said, that was not exactly planned, which was probably the most honest thing I had said all morning. Adrian's gaze held mine for a moment, steady, unreadable, and then, slowly, that same small smile returned, the one that made it feel like he was 10 steps ahead of me in a situation I did not even fully understand yet. And he said, I assumed as much, before straightening, stepping back just enough to restore that professional distance like nothing had happened at all, like we had just discussed a minor scheduling issue instead of the most embarrassing moment of my life. And then he added, in a completely normal tone, I will expect your draft by Friday. As if that sentence did not now carry an entirely different weight. And I stood there for a second after he walked away, trying to process the fact that not only did he remember, but he was very clearly not going to let me forget it either. I made it exactly 43 minutes before I completely lost my mind, which I think deserves some credit, because that is 43 minutes of sitting at my desk, staring at the same paragraph on my screen, and pretending I understood anything about the project I had just been assigned, when in reality my brain was stuck replaying one very specific detail over and over again. He remembered, not just remembered, but remembered enough to bring it up, casually, like it was just another fact. About me, like my name or my position. And that was a problem, a very big problem, because it meant this was not something I could just outwait. It was not going to fade into awkward silence or mutual agreement to ignore it. No. Adrian Cole had clearly decided this was something worth holding on to, and I did not know what to do with that. I tapped my pen against the desk, stopped, started again, opened a document, closed it, opened it again, typed one sentence, deleted it immediately because how was I supposed to focus on work when every time I blinked I could hear his voice again? You tend to act on impulse, and the worst part was that he was not wrong. I do act on impulse. I just usually manage to keep the consequences slightly less catastrophic. I let out a quiet sigh, leaning back in my chair and staring up at the ceiling for a second like maybe answers would appear there if I looked long enough. They did not, obviously, because the universe does not work like that. It works by making things progressively more complicated until you are forced to deal with them, which is exactly what happened next, because at precisely 10:43 a.m., an email popped up on my screen with his name at the top, and I swear my entire body froze before I even clicked on it. This is fine, I told myself. It is probably just work-related, just instructions, normal, professional. Nothing to do with anything else, except when I opened it. The message was short, almost annoyingly simple. Ethan, come to my office when you have a moment. And that was it. No explanation, no context, just a direct request that somehow felt like a summons. And I sat there for a full 10 seconds staring at it. Like maybe if I did not move it would resolve itself. Like maybe he would forget he sent it. Which was ridiculous, because this is Adrian Cole, a man who clearly does not forget things. Especially not things involving me. I glanced around the office, half expecting someone else to react, to say something. But everyone was focused on their own work, completely unaware that I was currently experiencing what felt like a personal crisis disguised as a routine workday. I looked back at the email, then at the clock, then back at the email again. And there was no way out of it. I could not ignore it. I could not pretend I did not see it, because that would only make things worse, so I did what any rational person would do when faced with an unavoidable, potentially humiliating situation. I overthought it for another 30 seconds, and then stood up anyway, smoothing down my shirt like that would somehow make me more prepared, more composed, more anything than I currently was. The walk to his office felt longer than it should have, every step echoing a little too loudly in my ears, every second stretching just enough to make me consider turning around and pretending I forgot something at my desk. But I did not, because I am many things, but apparently not someone who runs when it actually matters. I reached his door, paused for half a second, just enough time to take a breath, and then knocked, a quick, controlled sound that I hoped did not give away how fast my heart was beating. Come in. His voice came from inside, steady, familiar, and I swear that one simple sentence was enough to make everything feel 10 times more real. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and immediately became aware of the space. Of him, of the fact that this was no longer a public interaction where I could hide behind other people and vague professionalism. This was just the two of us, and as the door clicked shut behind me, I had the very distinct feeling that whatever happened next was not going to be something I could easily pretend did not matter. The moment the door closed behind me, the room felt smaller, not physically, but in that quiet, suffocating way where every sound becomes too clear, too sharp, like the soft click of the latch, the faint hum of the air conditioning, even the way my own breath sounded just a little too loud. And Adrian was there, standing by his desk, not sitting, not distracted, just watching me in that same calm, measured way that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking, which somehow made me more aware of everything, of the distance between us, of the fact that there was no one else here to absorb the tension, No one to interrupt. No easy way out. You wanted to see me, I said, because silence felt like the worst possible option, and my voice came out more steady than I expected, which was something, at least. Adrian nodded slightly. Yes, I did. And then he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit. And I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to consider staying. Standing, to keep some kind of invisible boundary between us. But that felt ridiculous, so I sat, placing my hands in my lap like that would stop them from fidgeting, from giving away how completely unprepared I was for whatever this conversation was about to be. For a moment, he did not say anything, just moved around the desk, took his seat, and opened a folder like this was a normal meeting. Like this was about work, which it probably was, or at least partially, and I tried to match that. Energy, to focus, to be professional. Except then he looked up, met my eyes, and said, "Your draft will require more structure than what I saw this morning," and I blinked, because that was not what I expected, not even close. I nodded quickly. Right, of course, I can revise it, I said, and for a second, relief flickered through me. Maybe this was just work, maybe I had overthought everything. Maybe he was going to ignore the other thing entirely, except then he added, almost as an afterthought, though the timing felt too precise to be accidental, "You seem distracted today." And there it was again, not direct, but close enough to feel intentional. I forced a small, polite smile, just adjusting to the new project, I said, which was technically true, just not the whole truth. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze still on me, steady, assessing, and for a moment, I had the distinct impression that he was deciding something, weighing something, before he spoke again, adjusting. He repeated, like he was testing the word, and then, quieter, just enough to shift the tone of the room, or avoiding, and my stomach dropped, because that was not a work question, not really. That was something else entirely. I opened my mouth, closed it, because what was I supposed to say to that? Yes, I am avoiding you because I accidentally kissed you, and now I do not know how to function like a normal person around you. That did not feel like a viable option, so I went with the safest answer I could manage. I am not avoiding anything, I said, and even I could hear the slight tension in my voice. The way it did not land as confidently as I wanted it to. Adrian's expression did not change much, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, like he had expected that answer, like he had already accounted for it. "I see," he said, and then he closed the folder in front of him, the soft sound echoing just enough to feel final, deliberate, and suddenly the conversation was no longer about work at all, because he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk, closing that distance just enough to make everything feel more immediate, more focused, and he said, still calm, still controlled, "Then perhaps I misunderstood the other night." And that sentence hit differently, because it was no longer vague, no longer something I could pretend not to understand. It was there, out in the open, just enough that I had to respond, and I could feel my heartbeat pick up again, my thoughts scrambling to catch up, because this was it. This was the moment where ignoring it was no longer an option, where I had to decide whether to deny it, deflect it, or acknowledge it in some way that would not completely destroy what little composure I had left. And the worst part was the way he watched me, patient, unhurried, like he was giving me the space to answer, but also fully expecting that I would. I should have said no, or at least something simple, something clean that would shut this down before it became anything more than a misunderstanding. But the problem with moments like this is that they stretch, they linger just long enough for every possible response to run through your head, and none of them feel right, because denying it felt like lying badly, and admitting it felt like stepping into something I did not fully understand. So I did the worst possible thing, I hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything became clearer, the memory, the exact way it happened, the way I had grabbed his shirt, the way I had not even checked, the way I had assumed, and I could feel the heat creeping up the back of my neck just thinking about it. "It was a mistake," I said finally, because that felt safe, that felt factual, that felt like something I could stand behind without completely unraveling. Adrian did not react immediately, which somehow made it worse, because the silence gave that sentence weight, made it sit there between us like something that needed to be examined. "A mistake," he repeated, not mocking, not dismissive, just considering, and I nodded, maybe a little too quickly. "Yeah, I thought you were someone else," which was true, painfully true, and for a second I thought that would be enough, that he would accept it, file it away as an unfortunate mix-up, and we could both move on. Except he did not look convinced, not exactly. There was a slight tilt of his head, a shift in his gaze like he was focusing on something more specific, something more precise. And then he said, "You did not seem uncertain at the time," and I swear my brain just short-circuited again, because how do you respond to that without making it worse? I opened my mouth, closed it, tried again. I was not exactly thinking clearly, I said, which felt like the understatement of the year, and for the first time, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, just a small flicker, like he found that answer interesting, or maybe honest, or maybe both. He leaned back slightly, giving me a fraction more space, but somehow not easing the tension at all. "Alcohol tends to lower inhibitions," he said, and I nodded, grateful for the neutral direction. Exactly. That is all it was, just a misunderstanding, and I almost believed it myself when I said it. Except then he added, quietly, almost thoughtfully, "And yet you chose to act on that impulse." And there it was again, that shift, that subtle push that turned a simple explanation into something more layered, something harder to dismiss. I let out a small breath, trying to keep my composure intact. "I did not realize it was you," I said, more firmly this time. Like if I emphasized that part enough it would anchor the whole situation. Adrian's gaze held mine for a moment, steady, searching, and then he asked, "Would it have made a difference?" And that question hit differently, because it was not about the past anymore. Not really. It was about something else. Something hypothetical that felt way too close to the present. I blinked, caught off guard. Because I had not thought about that. Not seriously, not in a way that required an actual answer. Of course it would. I said quickly, maybe too quickly, because that was the logical answer, the safe answer, the only answer that made sense in a professional setting where he was my boss and I was very much not supposed to be involved in anything remotely complicated. Adrian watched me for another second, like he was measuring that response against something only he understood, and then, slowly, he nodded, as if accepting it, or at least choosing not to challenge it further. "For now?" "I see," he said, and just like that, the tension shifted again, not gone, but different, quieter, like something had been acknowledged even if it was not fully resolved. He reached for the folder again, opening it with that same composed efficiency. "We will keep this professional," he continued, his tone returning to that steady, controlled cadence, and relief flickered through me so fast, it almost felt like a physical release. "Yes, of course," I said immediately, because that was exactly what I wanted, what I needed, a clear boundary, a way to move forward without constantly reliving that moment. Except as he glanced up at me one more time, there was something in his expression that did not quite match the words, something subtle, something unreadable, like the conversation might be over for now, but not finished, not really. And as I sat there, trying to convince myself that everything had just been neatly resolved, I had the distinct feeling that I had only just stepped into something that was not going to stay simple for very long. For the rest of the day, I told myself it was over, done, resolved in the most professional way possible, because he said it. "We will keep this professional," and that should have been enough. That should have been the boundary I needed to finally calm down and focus on work like a normal person. Except it was not, because the problem was not just what he said, it was how he said it, and more importantly, the way he looked at me right after, like there was something else behind it, something unspoken that made the words feel less like a conclusion and more like a temporary agreement. And that thought stayed with me as I returned to my desk, sat down, opened my laptop, and attempted for the 5th time to start working on the draft he had assigned. Except now every sentence felt heavier, every word more deliberate, because I knew he was going to read it, not just glance over it, not just approve it, but actually read it. And somehow that made everything harder. I kept rewriting the same paragraph, adjusting phrasing, deleting entire sections, overthinking things that would normally take me 10 minutes at most, and I hated it. I hated that he had somehow managed to get into my head this easily. That one conversation was enough to throw off my entire rhythm. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temple lightly, trying to reset, trying to remind myself that this was just work, just a project, just something I needed to finish by Friday. Nothing more, nothing complicated, except every time I almost settled into that mindset, something pulled me back, a memory, a word, The way he had asked would it have made a difference, and I found myself replaying that question again, slower this time, more carefully, because it was not just a casual remark, it was intentional, and I did not know why. I shook my head slightly, pushing the thought away. No, I was not going to go down that road. Not now, not when I had actual responsibilities to deal with. I forced myself to focus, typing out a full paragraph, then another, gradually finding a rhythm, something steady, something that felt like control again. And for a while, it worked. Time passed. The office noise blended into the background. Conversations, keyboards, the occasional phone ringing, all of it forming a kind of white noise that helped me stay grounded, until it did not. Until I became aware of it again. That same subtle shift, that same feeling. From earlier, like the air had changed slightly, and I did not need to look up to know why. Except I did anyway, because apparently I have no self-control when it comes to making things worse for myself. And there he was, standing near the far end of the office, speaking with someone from another team, completely composed, completely focused, like the conversation we had earlier had not happened at all. And for a second, I almost relaxed, because that was good. That was what I wanted. Normal, distant, professional, except then his gaze lifted, just briefly, just enough to scan the room, and it landed on me, not by accident, not by chance, but with a kind of quiet certainty that made my chest tighten again, and he held it for a fraction longer than necessary, not inappropriate, not obvious, just enough to remind me that nothing about this was as simple as I wanted it to be, and then he looked away, just like that, continuing his conversation like nothing had happened, and I sat there, staring at my screen, completely aware of one thing I had been trying to ignore all day. This was not over, not even close, and as much as I wanted to keep things clean, keep things distant, keep things professional, there was a part of me, small and inconvenient and very much unwanted, that was starting to wonder what would happen if it was not. I made it through the rest of the afternoon by sheer force of will and a questionable amount of caffeine. The kind that leaves your hands slightly unsteady and your thoughts moving just a little too fast. But at least it kept me focused enough to finish a decent portion of the draft, which felt like a small victory considering how the day had started. And by the time the clock hit 5:30, I was more than ready to leave, to put some distance between me and everything that had happened, to reset, or at least try to. I packed up my things quickly, not rushing, but not lingering either, because the last thing I needed was another unexpected interaction, especially not after spending hours pretending I was not hyper-aware of his presence somewhere in the same building. I stood, slung my bag over my shoulder, and made my way toward the elevators, blending in with the usual end-of-day crowd, people chatting, checking their phones, already mentally clocked out, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt normal again, like maybe I had overreacted, like maybe things would settle into something manageable if I just gave it time. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside along with a few others, pressing the button for the lobby and shifting slightly to make space. The doors began to close, and I let out a quiet breath, already thinking about dinner, about anything that was not this situation. And then, just as the doors were about to shut completely, they stopped, sliding open again. And I did not need to look to know, I just knew. That same instinct from earlier, that same subtle awareness that something had changed, and sure enough, Adrian stepped in, calm as ever, like this was just another normal moment in a perfectly ordinary day. Except it was not for me, because now we were in a confined space, smaller than his office, smaller than anything we had dealt with so far, and there was nowhere to go, no way to avoid it. I shifted slightly, instinctively creating distance, even though it was minimal at best, and focused on the numbers above the door like they were the most interesting thing I had ever seen. 1 floor, 2 floors, 3. Except I could feel it, that awareness again, sharper this time, closer, and I told myself not to look. Do not look, just wait it out. This will be over in less than a minute. You can handle less than a minute. Except then he spoke, and of course he did, because apparently silence was not something he felt obligated to maintain. Productive day, he said, his tone neutral, professional, like we were just colleagues making casual conversation. And I nodded, keeping my gaze forward. Yeah, getting there, I replied, which was technically true, and for a second, I thought that might be it, just small talk, nothing more, except then there was a brief pause, just long enough to shift the air again, and he added, Your focus improved, and I blinked, because that was not something a director casually observes about an intern unless he has been paying attention, which meant he had been paying attention, which raised several questions I was not prepared to deal with. I let out a small breath, trying to keep my tone light. I had a good incentive, I said, which could be interpreted a lot of ways, most of which I hoped he would not choose. Adrian's reflection in the elevator doors shifted slightly as he turned his head just enough to look at me directly, and I could feel that look without even fully meeting it. Incentive, he repeated, and there was something in his voice, not quite teasing, not quite serious, just enough to make that single word carry more weight than it should. I hesitated for half a second, then forced myself to glance at him, just briefly, just enough to acknowledge the question. The deadline, I said, because that was safe, that was correct, that was the answer I was supposed to give, and for a moment, he just looked at me, like he was deciding whether to accept that or push further, and then, slowly, that same small, knowing expression appeared again, the one that made it clear he was aware of more than he was saying. Deadlines can be effective, he said, and the elevator chimed, doors sliding open to the lobby, releasing the tension all at once. People stepped out, conversations resumed, the world continued like nothing had happened, and I moved with them, stepping out into the open space, finally able to breathe normally again. Except as I walked toward the exit, I could still feel it, that lingering awareness, that sense that even in a crowded lobby, even with distance and noise and movement, he was still there, still present in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And as I pushed through the revolving doors into the evening air, I realized something I had been trying very hard not to admit. This was not just about a mistake anymore, not just about one moment at a party. It was turning into something else, something slower, more deliberate, and I was not entirely sure I wanted to stop it. I told myself I would not think about him the moment I stepped outside, that once the cool evening air hit and the noise of the city wrapped around me, everything would settle back into something manageable, something distant. Except that did not happen, because instead of fading, the awareness followed me, lingering in the back of my mind like a question I had not answered properly. And I walked the first 2 blocks barely noticing anything around me, not the traffic, not the people, not even the usual routine I relied on to ground myself after a long day. All I could hear was that same quiet voice replaying in my head. Deadlines can be effective, and it should not have meant anything. It was just a comment, just a normal observation. Except the way he said it made it feel like it was about more than work, like there was something layered underneath that I had not fully unpacked yet. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair as I stopped at a crosswalk, the red hand blinking back at me like it had something to say about my life choices. You are overthinking again, I muttered under my breath, because that was the simplest explanation, the safest one. This is just a new boss, a new project, an awkward coincidence that will eventually lose its intensity. People adjust, situations normalize. That is how things work. Except the problem was that nothing about this felt like it was settling. If anything, it was sharpening, becoming more defined with every interaction, and I did not know what to do with that. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of the loop just enough to breathe. I pulled it out, expecting a message from a friend, maybe something normal to anchor me back into reality. But it was an email, and the moment I saw his name at the top, my entire body stilled again. Not here, not now, I thought, because I had just left, I had just created distance, and somehow he was still managing to reach into that space. I opened it anyway, because apparently I have a habit of making things harder for myself. The message was short, just like the last one, direct, controlled. Ethan, I reviewed your outline. There are a few points that need clarification. Come by tomorrow morning. And that should have been it. Just work, just feedback, normal. Except there was one more line, separate from the rest, almost like an afterthought, almost like it did not belong in a professional email at all. You tend to think in circles. It might help to focus on what you actually want, and I just stood there on the sidewalk, staring at that sentence, because that was not about the project, not really. That was about me, about the way I had been responding all day, the way I had been avoiding and deflecting and trying to keep everything neatly categorized. And the worst part was that he was right. I do think in circles. I do overanalyze until nothing feels simple anymore. And now he had pointed it out, not in a way that was obvious or inappropriate, but in a way that felt deliberate, like he was nudging something, pushing just enough to see how I would react. I locked my phone, slipping it back into my pocket, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the city move around me, letting the noise fill the space where my thoughts had been, except they did not stay quiet for long, because that question he implied, "What do you actually want?" started to settle in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and I did not have an easy answer for it. Not when it came to work, not when it came to him, and definitely not when it came to the way everything had shifted in just a single day. I resumed walking, slower this time, more aware, more present, and as I moved through the crowd, blending into something ordinary again, there was one thing I could not shake. This was no longer just about avoiding a mistake. It was about deciding what to do with it. And I had a feeling that by tomorrow morning, that decision was not going to stay optional. I barely slept that night, not in any meaningful way, because every time I closed my eyes, my brain would replay the same moments with frustrating clarity. The party, the office, the elevator, the way he looked at me when he asked questions that did not feel like questions, and then that message. You tend to think in circles, focus on what you actually want, and it should not have stayed with me the way it did. It should have been easy to dismiss, just a passing comment, except it was not. Because it felt like he had seen something I had been trying very hard to ignore, and the worst part was that I did not even know how to answer it myself. I stared at the ceiling in the early hours of the morning, watching the faint glow of city lights bleed through the blinds, and for once, I did not try to overanalyze every possible outcome. I just let the question sit there, quiet and persistent, until eventually, exhaustion pulled me under for a few hours of restless sleep. The next morning came too quickly, sharp and unforgiving, and by the time I stepped into the office, coffee in hand and thoughts still slightly tangled, I had made a decision, not a perfect one, not a fully thought out one, but something solid enough to hold on to. I was going to stop avoiding this, whatever this was. I was not going to pretend it did not exist, because clearly that strategy was not working. I reached my desk, set my bag down, opened my laptop, and tried to focus on the draft, refining the points he mentioned, tightening the structure, making sure everything was clear and deliberate. And for the first time since yesterday, it felt easier, not because the situation had changed, but because I had, slightly. I was not running from it anymore, or at least I was trying not to. Time passed, the usual rhythm of the office settling in around me, and before I could talk myself out of it, I stood up, because if I was going to do this, I needed to do it properly. No hesitation, no last-minute excuses, just go. I walked to his office with a steadier pace than yesterday, not slow, not rushed, just intentional, and when I reached the door, I knocked, the sound firm, controlled. "Come in." His voice came from inside, the same as before, calm, measured, and I pushed the door open, stepping into the space that already felt familiar in a way I was not entirely comfortable with. Adrian looked up from his desk, his gaze landing on me almost immediately, like he had been expecting this, like the timing was not a surprise at all. "I have the revised draft," I said, holding up my tablet slightly, keeping my tone even, professional, but this time, there was something else underneath it, something steadier. He studied me for a moment, just long enough to notice the difference, I think. Before nodding, "Set it down," he said, and I stepped forward, placing it on his desk, close enough to feel that shift again, that awareness. But this time, I did not step back immediately. I stayed, just for a second longer than necessary, enough to acknowledge it instead of avoiding it. Adrian's eyes flickered up to mine again, sharper now, more focused, like he had caught that change, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence settling in, but it felt different from before, less suffocating, more deliberate, like something was waiting to be said. So I said it, before I could overthink it. "You asked what I actually want," and my voice was steady, even if my pulse was not. Adrian did not interrupt, did not react immediately, just watched me, giving me that same space, that same patience that made it impossible to back out now. I took a small breath, grounding myself, and continued. "I want this to be clear," I said, meaning the work, the situation, everything, but also something else, something I was only just starting to understand. I do not want to keep pretending like nothing happened, because that is not working. And there it was, out in the open, not dramatic, not reckless, just honest in a way I had been avoiding until now. Adrian's expression shifted, subtly, something unreadable but unmistakably present, and for the first time, it felt like we were standing on the same point, not opposite sides of something undefined, but right at the edge of whatever came next, and as the silence stretched again, I realized that this time, I was not trying to escape it, I was waiting to see where it would go. For a moment, nothing happened, not in the way I expected, no immediate response, no sharp reaction, just silence. But it was not the same kind of silence as before, it was steadier, more grounded, like the air had shifted into something clearer now that the words were out there, and Adrian did not look away, did not deflect, he just watched me, really watched me this time, like he was measuring what I had said against everything that had happened up until now, and I held that gaze, which felt like its own kind of decision, because a day ago I would have looked down, would have stepped back, would have tried to soften it into something less direct, but not now. Now I stayed exactly where I was, and after a few seconds, he nodded, once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something important, something that mattered more than the surface of the conversation. That is a reasonable position, he said, his voice calm. But there was something underneath it, something quieter, less distant than before, and I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding. Because that was not rejection, that was not dismissal, that was something closer to agreement, or at least acceptance. He glanced down at the tablet on his desk, scrolling through the document briefly, and for a second, the moment shifted back into something familiar, something structured. He pointed out a few adjustments, phrasing, clarity, the kind of feedback I could actually process without my brain spiraling, and I responded in kind, nodding, asking a question, refining a point, and it felt almost normal, almost easy, except it was not entirely, because beneath that layer of professionalism, there was still something else, something present, something neither of us was ignoring anymore. And after a few minutes, he set the tablet aside, leaning back slightly, and the conversation paused again, not awkward, not uncertain, just open, and this time, he spoke first. You prefer clarity, he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and I nodded, because that was true, even if I did not always act like it. It is easier that way, I replied, and he considered that for a moment, his gaze steady, focused in that same way that made it feel like he was always seeing more than he said. Then we should be clear about this as well, he continued, and my pulse picked up again, not from panic this time, but from anticipation, because this was it, the part that had been building under everything else. He did not rush it, did not make it dramatic, just said it simply, directly, I am not interested in pretending it did not happen either. And that sentence landed in a way I was not entirely prepared for, because it matched what I had said, mirrored it, and for the first time, it felt like we were not just reacting to the same event from different angles, but actually meeting somewhere in the middle of it. I swallowed lightly, processing that, and then he added, just as evenly, but with a subtle shift that made the meaning sharper, but I am also not interested in blurring lines that should remain clear. And there it was, the boundary, not cold, not dismissive, just defined, and I nodded, because I understood that. I had understood that from the beginning, even if I had not handled it perfectly. Of course, I said, keeping my tone steady, because that mattered, that balance, whatever this was, it was not something reckless, not something careless. Adrian watched me for another second, like he was confirming that, and then, slowly, that small, almost imperceptible smile appeared again, the one that felt less like amusement now and more like recognition, and he said, good. And just like that, the moment settled into something new, not resolved, not finished, but aligned in a way it had not been before. I picked up my tablet, stepping back this time, but not because I felt the need to escape, just because the conversation had reached a natural pause. I will revise this and send an update, I said, returning to something practical, something grounded. Adrian nodded. I will review it. And as I turned toward the door, hand reaching for the handle, I paused for just a second, not because I was unsure, but because I was aware of everything that had shifted in less than 24 hours of the fact that what started as a mistake had turned into something defined, something intentional. And as I stepped out into the hallway, the door closing quietly behind me, I realized that for the first time since that night, I was not trying to forget it anymore. I was carrying it forward, carefully, deliberately, into whatever came next.